All right, I'm getting tons of questions on the XMR 700 I bought and why I didn't get an 850 and all these questions over and over again on like all the social media platforms. So I'm making another video about this, mostly so I can just send the link to this video to people that ask the same question over and over again. But anyway, XMR 700 versus all of the big Gen 2 XMRs, right? So the 700 is really a 650, but that's the Gen 3, and these are your Gen 2s that are, like the serious XMRs. I didn't put the 650 and the 570 in here because, well, they're kind of the same thing as the 850 with just less power. And by that I mean they're literally the same thing, like same transmission, diffs, whatever. So we're just going to talk about these four. And first thing I did is I went to the manufacturer spec sheets, read through those, pulled those specs into an Excel file so I could compare them conveniently. And then I added a few of my own kind of categories just to talk about. There's a lot of misinformation and confusion about these things on all the forums because, well, people get their opinions from other people instead of making opinions from data. So we're going to try to use the data to extrapolate some actual useful opinions here. Now, just to mention it, I've owned two XMR Renegade 1000s. I had an XMR 650 for a little while, and I had a 570L. So I've had four V-twin Can-Ams, and I've only kept each of those for a couple months each because they all had so many issues. I just couldn't. I could keep them running, but I ride pretty hard. I go pretty deep all the time, and I was working on them just as much as I was riding them, and that's not a good fun to pain ratio because I don't like really working on cams very much. So I got rid of them all pretty quick. But reliability concerns aside, we're not talking about that in this video. We're just going to talk about the specs and the improvements that they've made in the Gen 3. Okay, let me flip over to my spreadsheet and we're going to get nerdy. So I went through and highlighted a few things here to talk about. I'm just going to go through row by row and talk about the things that kind of stick out in the spreadsheet. So the first thing that's important with an ATV that's for mudding is, does it have appropriate gearing, right? On a mudding ATV, you're going to put taller tires, probably fatter tires, and more aggressive tires. So did the manufacturer give you mud-specific gearing, okay? With all the XMRs, you think the answer is yes. Unfortunately, the XMR 570, 650, and 850, in my opinion, should not be called XMRs. They do not have mud-specific gearing. The low range ratio, the diff ratio, the size of the clutching is the same as a base model that comes on 30 or 25s, even though they're coming on 30s. I'm going to say that again because I've said this a million times and no one gets it. The XMR 850 does not have mud-specific gearing. That's why you see people tearing up the belts on these all the time. Can-Am just threw snorkels on it, they threw a radiator on it, and they threw some tires on it. That's it. Okay? XMR 650 should not be called an XMR. An extreme mud racer should have mud-specific gearing. Now, the 1000s have a totally different transmission, so they do have a lot lower gearing in low. It's the transmission out of the 6x6, if you're curious. And the XMR 700 has mud-specific gearing. Now, that doesn't tell you the whole story, right? You actually want to know the actual ratios. And if you're curious about that, I have tons of other videos where I've calculated the actual complete kind of crawl ratios of these machines. And the XMR 700 is the best, by the way. But the 1000s are not too far behind. Again, the 850 XMR has the same gearing as a base model cheapo 570L on 25-inch tires. That's why you've never seen me on an XMR 850, because the first thing I would have to do after buying it is swap the transmission with one out of 1000. All right, so that's the most important thing to talk about, but let's talk about price real quick. The prices on everything has gotten insane lately. 17,000 plus for an XMR 1000 Renegade, 16,000 for an Outlander. It's just out of control, right? Meanwhile, the Gen 3 700 is MSRP is only 10,550, and by the time you get dealer fees and everything added on that, I paid about 12,500 out the door, tax tag and title for my Gen 3. So you got to remember to add that to these. I mean, they're incredibly expensive, and these are Gen 2s, so these are kind of outdated, and the prices just keep climbing. That's also true with the Highlifter edition, by the way, the Highlifter Sportsman. It's gotten incredibly expensive, and they put no R&D into updating it, which is pretty sad. Okay, so this thing wins on price, hands down. Keep that in mind. Now we're going to talk about a few other things. Ready to relocate. They all get it except for the Renegade. Fender coverage, they all get it except for the Renegade. Clutching, this is a very important one. The Gen 2 clutching is decent, but it's not great. Most people, especially on XMR 850, have to upgrade the clutching to turn an aggressive 32-inch tire on a Gen 2. Let me show you why. So this is the Gen 2 clutches, what they look like. You can see the pulleys aren't super big. They're kind of about the same size. So, you know, if you have a small pulley here and a big pulley here, you get a big gear reduction from your belt, right? These are the Gen 2 clutches. They've been around forever. They require a lot of tuning. There's a lot of wear items in them. They're not super great. For the Gen 3, Can-Am totally redesigned the clutches. And what you can see here right off the bat is, oh man, I can't zoom anymore. This secondary clutch is huge, which means you get a bigger gear reduction from your clutching alone on the Gen 3. Now, the reason this is so huge is because this engine is out of a side-by-side, right? They popped the engine out of the HD7 or the 700 Maverick Trail, and they threw it in this ATV. So it's got clutching that's designed to handle way more of a heavy vehicle, way more load, way more work. The new clutching is badass. It feels great on my stock 28s. It also feels great on my 33s. I haven't tuned it or touched it at all. It's very versatile clutching. Also, it's got a lot more use of rollers and things that reduce friction, and the cooling is really good. So I think the clutching is a huge improvement on the Gen 3. Another thing to point out here is if you look at the clutch box, it's aluminum on the back half of the clutch, and it's part of the engine. So there's no primary penetrations back there for water to get in because it's part of the engine. There's no leaks. Whereas on every Gen 2 Can-Am I've had to pull the clutches off, pull the back of the belt box, and reseal it. Also, look how few fasteners there are on this belt box. So not only is it plastic, and it's right next to your exhaust header, and there's two exhausts, it's a V-twin, there's all kind of heating going on. There's not a ton of fasteners. So these boxes are kind of hard to keep sealed, and if your belt explodes, it'll crack the box, and then you're just screwed. Again, a lot more fasteners, aluminum, way better belt box. Okay, I think I beat that point to death. So we talked about the belt box material, easy to shift. The small transmission that's in like the XMR 850 is junk. I've seen so many blow up, it's crazy. People are having to like rock the bike and yank on it to get it to shift, trying to back out of a mud hole. Just really clunky, poorly designed transmission, and they're still selling it because laziness. The 1000 transmission is a little better. It's definitely stronger, but it's still hard to shift. XMR 700 transmission so far has been an absolute peach. It shifts with 2 fingers, very nice positive engagement. One thing to point out is that it does have a reverse chain. If I break it, I'll be the first person to tell you, but so far it's working good. Diff lock, they all have real diff lock, so they have Visco lock, and then they have the option to override Visco lock and go to full locker, which is great. Plastics, Renegade plastics are terrible. They're a pain in the ass to take off for cleaning the machine or doing any kind of maintenance. Everything's packed in there, really outdated design. The 1000 Outlander and XMR plastics are decent, but the 700 plastics on the new Gen 3 are great. You can pop them off with one hand and get to whatever you need to get to. Couple plastic clips, the wheel liners come off. I really like the plastics so far. Getting the belts easy, you know, not that I've ever had to other than to just measure the gear ratios, but it's very nice. Heat issues. So the Renegades have a lot of heat issues. The plastics are really packed around the motor. They're trying to make it look more compact. But you got to remember that a Renegade is really just an Outlander with different plastics, right? There's no difference to the engine and frame or anything. So the packaging is tight on a Renegade. Also, your radiators up front, down low, so it's getting full of mud. I had to clean both my Renegade radiators religiously to make them not overheat. Huge pain in the butt. But the Outlanders all have good radiators, and you know, they're V-twins though. So you got 2 exhaust pipes running around between your legs. That's melting stuff. Both my Renegades melted plastics. My Outlander didn't melt plastics, but it was very, very hot between your legs. The Gen 3 is a single cylinder, 650, so you don't have 2 exhaust pipes, and you don't have all this heat radiating between your legs, so it's a lot better packaging, and it's a lot more comfortable on a hot day, just because of the way the heat and everything's routed. The radiator blows air down, the belt exhaust comes back down and blows on it, and it carries a lot of heat out the rear of the machine, and you don't really feel it as a rider. So I think the heat management is great on the new Gen 3. Okay, these are some specs from the actual spec sheets. One thing to point out here, if you look at them, let's look at this one for instance. Can-Am took out the suspension travel numbers from a lot of their Gen 2s. And I don't know if it's because they're hiding something and they changed it, or if it's just a lazy omission, but you really should tell us that on a $17,000 machine with Fox shocks, you should probably tell us how much travel it has. That's pretty shisty. So yeah, I looked it up on some other sources, and people say that for a Gen 2, it's about 9.2, 9.9 inches front to rear. The Gen 3, even though it's a budget machine, right, it's way cheaper, 90% cheaper, still has essentially the same suspension travel. It's a totally new design. It's not trailing arm anymore. I think it rides significantly better. I love the suspension. It's awesome. Now, everyone complains that the XMR 700 is not really a Can-Am, right? Why would you buy a single cylinder Can-Am? It's only got 50 horsepower, da 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 da. 50 horsepower is a ton of power for an ATV. If you couple that with the fact that it has less weight and more efficient clutching than the Gen 2, it's not that slow. Yes, it doesn't have the crazy high RPM scream of a V-twin. Yes, you're probably not going to be skimming it in factory form, but it has plenty of adequate power for any kind of mudding situation. Like, you can turn the tires slowly, you can creep them with the great gearing, but it does have enough power when you open it up to clean the tires out in the thickest, stickiest mud that I've found. And yeah, I mean, the 90 horsepower is cool, and except for you have to consider all of these downsides and all the reliability concerns that come with putting 90 horsepower through a rubber band drive transmission. So, yeah, I mean, if all you think about is horsepower, 100%, these are the way to go. Go spend an extra $5,000 and have fun. I've done it. It's not worth it. It's not needed. It's just kind of like, show off BS stuff. But yeah, go put some shiny wide wheels on it and have fun with that. But this is the one place that the XMR 700 obviously is way, way worse than the other V-twin Can-Ams, single cylinder. We could get in the discussion forever, but it's always going to have less power and less RPMs. But 50 horsepower for a quad is plenty. I know everyone's power crazy with these, 200 horsepower plus factory side-by-sides with turbos and stuff. But at least it has a roll cage, right? And enough suspension to use that power. These are ATVs. They have like 10 inches of suspension travel. They're small. 50 horsepower is more than adequate. It's all you need, right? Let's put it that way. Fox shocks, the 1000s have the premium Fox shocks. These other ones do not, but I think the shocks on my 700 ride really nice. They're not fully threaded, so you don't get all that preload adjustability. A threaded shock, honestly, would be great, but does not have it. Rack capacity, the Gen 3 wins here again. The new rear suspension can handle more weight, which is good because it has a huge cooler space, or you can put a seat back there, and I think it's pretty comfortable riding a passenger. Wheelbase is actually a good one to talk about. All the regular Gen 2s are 51-inch wheelbase, and the school bus is 59. I think this is just way too big. Turning radius sucks. When it falls off a water wheelie, the front end just bottoms out. It's just too long. If you put a 6-inch lift or portals, that wheelbase works nice, but found the factory, it's just so long, it gets bellied out a lot. There's not enough weight on the rear wheels. It's very front biased. I don't like driving anything with that long wheelbase. I've never bought one. I've ridden my buddies a lot. I just hate the feel. 51 inches feels good, but you do, when you put 33-inch tires on them, you feel like the tires are going to touch each other because they're so close to your feet. That doesn't leave a whole lot of room for your feet between the tires. The Gen 3 is 53 inches, which gives you some more tire clearance possibilities, give you some longer floorboards, which is great for a passenger. I've raked my front arms forward, I think, 1.5 inches, so I'm like sitting right between 51 and 59, probably around 55 inches, 54.5 inches. I think that's a great wheelbase. So I like the wheelbase on the new one a lot. Yeah, I think the Gen 3 platform is a great platform. It's brand new, so it's got some small issues I need to work through. The engine mounts are too soft, so the engine torques around a lot. That's eventually going to cause problems for me. So hopefully Can-Am will make some updated engine mounts, maybe for 2025 or something when those start coming out, or aftermarket will have to do it. But that's a little annoying. So it's got some squeaks and stuff when the engine rocks around, and it's little things like that. But overall, the fact that I can throw 33-inch tires on it in stock configuration and spin the shit out of them is awesome. You really can't do that even with my XMR 1000 Renegade. It would turn 33s if you were on the power, but if you tried to creep them, you could smell the belt and you had a lot of squealing. I've never had any of that happen with the new clutching on the Gen 3. The clutching is super solid. If you want more details about the actual ratios on the Gen 3 and the clutching and all this stuff, check the description for a link where I calculated the final drive ratio of the Gen 3 XMR. I also have videos I'll put in the description where I did a gear reduction on it using some HD7 gears. And if you like all this kind of stuff and you made it through the end of this really long, boring video, check out the Patreon page because you'd probably like all the nerdy stuff I post on there as well.